All right. How about audio? Can you hear me well? Should be turned on for sure. Okay. Great, thank you. All right. Let's talk about CSS. Ooh, yeah. It's pretty exciting. We move fast, right? Like we move really fast here. So that's okay. It works. We can see from some of the results, right? It works well. So like every other topic, we're going to spend a day, maybe a day and a half on this new one. And I've got to admit something though. CSS is not my strength. I'm up here teaching it to you. It's good we're talking about the basics today, because if we were to go into some really advanced stuff, I would have to spend a lot more time preparing for that. So take that for what it is. I'm gonna do my best. I've done this a few times for sure, and I kind of review it to make sure that I'm accurate after each time. But it is a little stressful for me to get up here teaching a topic that I don't work with CSS every day. I tend to leave that to other people that are better. So I think doing this presentation though, it really kind of strengthened my understanding of CSS, and that's something that excites me about kind of this topic, or learning new things. So this week we have a new project, of course, and we're going to be building a single page application in the browser. So who here is familiar with CSS? You've done CSS before, okay. Shmu's done CSS, yeah. And what about, do we have people familiar with CSS in Victoria? A little, okay, cool. A little from Gabe. Sammy says, yeah, thumbs up. Some of us do. Okay, great. So what I want to invite you though is, if you feel like I'm telling you something that's wrong based on what you've learned already, please tell me, because that happens with the topics that I'm not super confident in, right? Don't feel like I'm up here knowing absolutely everything and that you can't maybe argue against something that I've mentioned. So like I said, I'm trying my best to be accurate, but I think if you know something better, you should feel free to say so. Okay, so that single page application what we're building is, it means that we're going to actually really just load up like one index.html into the browser, rather than with Tiny App where you would make a request, it would give you some HTML. You'd make another request, the server would give you different HTML. Now what we're going to do is load up a single page of HTML. It's going to load up some JavaScript for us, and that JavaScript is going to take it from there in terms of changing the content that the user sees on the screen. We're going to be using jQuery to do this, for example, right? So that's what this whole week is, but in order to make the site look a certain way, we have to learn a little bit about CSS, and that's, like I said, the next couple days. Here's Tweeter, that single page application. Let's see. Have we all seen what it looks like? No? Okay, so we should maybe take a quick peek at what it looks like. That's going to take me, oh, of course. Yeah. All right. And then we are on week 3. Starts today, Tweeter. This is kind of what it's going to look like. So obviously we need CSS in order to style this. If we just use pure HTML, we can come anywhere close to what this looks like. And it is important that we make this make our app look this way, because part of the assignment is to take the requirements, to take the designs that are given to you, and get pixel perfect if possible. See, I keep walking out of frame, I think. So sorry about that, Victoria. Maybe I should make a bigger frame. Let's do that. And then I can walk around. It makes me feel a little less nervous about this. Okay. There we go. If you want me to switch it back, Victoria, though, you are in full control of what scene we use. That's totally up to you. Okay. So this application should look the way that we have described it here. Okay. So we need to learn about CSS in order to make this happen. But before we start with CSS, let's talk about week 3 a little bit. Documentation. We're going to expect a little bit more in terms of reading documentation from you because it's now the 3rd week. So this is an opportune time to call it out. It's not specific to CSS. It's just in general, as we're learning these things, let's spend a bit more time reading the documentation. And if you have a misunderstanding, or maybe you're having a hard time understanding something that's in the documentation, do an assistance request and read the documentation with a mentor, because that's kind of how we learn how documentation is structured, how we can find the information we're looking for, because it's not automatic, and not all documentation is created equally. So we have to start now actively learning a little bit about reading documentation, all right? I definitely recommend MDN for the CSS documentation. Stay away from W3 schools. Okay. So we don't have a lot of time to talk about HTML. Good news is that should have been, I think, is it in prep work before you even start the course at all? This weekend for sure, though, right? This weekend for sure. So we learned a little bit about each HTML this weekend, so we should at least understand kind of how the tags work, and of course the people who are somewhat familiar with CSS. Okay, barely for Gabe. Cool. Yeah. I'm going to go over it quickly, but again, it's not something I can spend a lot of time on, but if there are questions, please let me know. I kind of I built this example here, and what it ends up being is an HTML document, and let's not worry about the words on here, just gonna structure first, okay? Structure first, word second. This HTML document, I can just open this in my browser, index.html, and it happens to be the notes for this lecture as an HTML document, right? Okay. So we can use this to kind of see how, first off, HTML, we can look at a couple tags there. Then we can also see how we can apply CSS to a document. That's important. We need to know how the different ways that we can take a CSS document or even embed the styles directly into our HTML document. We want to kind of see an example maybe of how we can change the CSS right in the browser to start to debug or decide how we want this thing to look. We can get some live updating. That's pretty exciting. So the content doesn't really matter. All I wanted was something kind of substantial that I could use a lot of different tags with. And so I've got H1s and H2s. Those are different types of headers, right? Or headings, let's say headings. Paragraph, that means that, well, P tag, that means paragraph. So we're going to put a paragraph in there. And a paragraph has some style to it. I can show you what a paragraph looks like by opening up these dev tools, clicking on this little arrow. It lets me select an element in the page to inspect. So I click on this arrow, and I want to inspect this header, H1. As I roll over it, we can see a lot about this header and the styles that are applied to it and why it looks the way that it does. Right now, this H1 has a certain size. Oops, we can see that in our debugger. We can kind of see that. Sorry for not being able to zoom in kind of up in the top left corner. It's saying that it's 538 by 46 pixels. We've also got this sort of orange, these two orange lines. And that's actually giving us a bit of space between this text and the text below it. If we remove that, which we can do right here in the editor, we actually, when we select this item, either through the elements panel here or directly in the page with this arrow, it tells us what styles are applied to this element right down here in the corner. We can see from the bottom up that these are the styles coming from something called reset.css, and then reset.css and styles.css, and then something called the user agent style sheet. Right? So I can disable this single property here if I want to with the arrow. And look at what happens when I change the font size of my H1. I'm getting rid of that style, so I go back and I look down here. Font size is 100%. Okay, so that's setting it there, which overwrote the font size at 2EM. So we can see that actually font size is being applied to that element by a bunch of different rules. Okay, so we should talk about that a little bit too. That's going to be, I think, an interesting aspect of this. But it looks like the rule that's at the highest in this list here is the one that's actually applied to it. Okay. So let's look at our document and see, how do we actually tell this document to start using styles? One of the ways is we can define those styles in a separate document. Okay, so I've got in my folder here, I've got example index.html right here, and then beside that is reset.css and styles.css. All right. So I could just do use a link tag here, which with a reference to the reset.css file. Okay, and if this was in another directory, styles / I could just path to that directory. Okay, I've made it easy by putting them into the same directory, but this is more about the fact that we can use a link tag to pull in styles from somewhere else. That's an important concept here, and that means that that document is the result of a single request, let's say, to the server. So maybe your HTML loads up. We don't have styles yet. Downloads those styles, applies them, and now we see the styles on the page. This happens so quickly for most people that they don't notice that happening. But I'm sure you've seen it before where that style sheet had a hard time downloading. And so you saw an unstyled document for a few seconds, and then all of a sudden it pops into place. That's likely because they have imported their styles from another file and some sort of network issue occurred. We don't worry so much about that, especially not today. That's not a problem. Okay, so one way we can do this, we bring in styles from another file, and that just looks like styles.css here. I've just defined some rules for different elements in my document. And these are the kind of the same things that we would see if we looked over here. Right? I can apply the same style or properties to multiple tags too if I want to. So all of my headers should have the same font margin line height, but depending on which header it is, the font size will be different. Right? So I'm able to compose these things together to create the final style for my H1, but it's a little bit of common stuff and then a little bit of specific stuff, but all being applied. That's kind of cool. Okay. Another way for us to apply style into a document is just with a style tag, and normally this goes in the head of the document. You'll see here my document has a overall section called HTML. That's going to be our top level of the document. And within there we've got two children, the head and the body. And so the head of my document is maybe some meta information about that document. Usually it's not things we can see on the page itself, although we put the title in there, which we can see up here. Right? So in the head we have things like maybe the char set we want to tell the browser we want it to use, or this meta viewport stuff. That's for some responsive behavior. So we'd learn about that at the end of the week, I think. Okay, we'll leave that for now. But this is just telling the browser about the document, whereas the body here is describing the actual HTML that represents the document. So we do want to decide where does this tag belong. Is it actually more of a is it more metadata, or does it actually belong in the rendering of the document? And that's how we decide whether or not it goes in the body or the head. So style tags, those go in the head because although they do manipulate the way the document looks, they're not actually being essentially like rendered elements. So we'll put that here. H1, font, color, red. Okay, so I'm just saying here, I think that's right. Oh no, it's not font color, my mistake, it's just color. See, that's because I don't do this every day. So color is the property that we'll use to describe the color of the text in an element. So I'm going to set it to red here, and we'll see how what happens when I reload this. We've just changed the color of that header here, and we can see that all those same properties are still being applied to it. And now this new one that I defined in the style tag is also being applied to it. So we can intermix this stuff. It's not kind of choose one. Although I do recommend be consistent with the way you apply your styles if you can, right? Okay. It's a lot nicer if you're consistent. You kind of know this is where I go to change this thing. Whereas if I do it this way, where some of it is in a file and some of it is in the HTML document, then I'm having to open both those up to find it. Or maybe, worst case, I find it in my first, or best case, I find it in my first attempt. Yes, Clive. I would recommend putting your styles into a separate document. So for Victoria, Clive was saying, is it bad practice to put this in the style tag? And I'd say it's not. I mean, it's hard for me to say it's bad practice because there are situations where we use a style tag for sure. But I would say for organizing your project, it makes a lot more sense to put your styles into representative files, and not just one, but broken down into something that makes sense for the project you're working on. And that's the thing that kind of changes for me is how I structure those files, or what I name those files, for example. In this case, I put everything into a styles.css, but I did break it up a little bit, right? I've got this thing called reset.css, which I haven't even explained to you what that's there for yet. And then I have this styles.css. I didn't just create one document, put them all in there, even though I could have. But conceptually, these documents do different things for me. One of them, reset.css, what it's supposed to do is set the underline styles across the board, across all the browsers, for all the elements that I'm interested in. It tries to make sure that they are all the same for me, so that if I use Firefox or Chrome, both of them start with the same styles. And the reason why this is because browsers have their own set of styles as well, called the user agent style sheets, that they apply to documents. And we want to make sure that if Chrome and Firefox's starting point is different, that we reset it to be the same. Okay, I will speak a little bit more about that. Smooth. Yeah, the question is, do I have reset.css above styles.css for that purpose? Does it matter what order they are in? It does matter what order they are in. In reset, you're going to notice that I'm actually using someone else's reset that I got from here. So let's just go to that page quickly. It's a good one. It's a good one, and it's free, and the license is really good. There's no license. I like to keep this in here just because, yeah, this attribution's really nice. I think, they did a nice thing for us to kind of figure out how to normalize this. And so what it's saying is all of these elements here should start with these styles. That means all margins should be set to 0. All padding should be set to 0. So we're doing that first, and then after that we can predictably change those values and have them look the same way across the board, right? And the reason we do this, again, is because if we're building it in Chrome, and Chrome has a different value for that margin, and then we move over to Firefox, we had built this page assuming that the margin was 0, whereas Firefox set it to 8 pixels or something on us. So then we just put this reset in there. Firefox sets it to 0, or we set it to 0 across the board, and then we overwrite it if we need to later on. Okay? The order matters because these styles will be applied, and then these styles will be applied, and then these styles will be applied. And actually, the question I might have then is, so obviously if I set the font size here to something crazy like 5 rem, I'm not going to tell you what a rem is yet, but we will get into that. That's massive now, right? What happens if I take this style tag and put it here before the link tag where my styles get set? So what I would expect is that reset might reset this. That's fine. Then the style tag will set it to 5 rem, which is going to be really big. But then my style.css should bring it back down to 1.5 rem, or whatever I had it to in here. Okay. And that's how it's working. We can see that down here, it tried to set that h1 using index.html style tag, but then styles.css got loaded, so it just overwrote that. Okay, so order of styles matters, not just how we load the files, but how they are defined within those files themselves. For example, everything's red now. even though I set the color here to be this sort of dark blue, because this set of rules here, actually, yeah, that's fine. I kind of wanted to do it here, actually. There we go. So this order matters as well as the order that we include the things in the files. Okay? Order matters totally. That's a really, I'm glad you brought it up because it's not too early to learn that. Okay. So do we have, there's one more way. And this, so we said that creating a style tag may not necessarily be bad practice, which I believe. Embedding your styles directly into an HTML element, which is our third option, that's where we really want to be careful. Okay. I think it's just, well, we'll still pick on this H1 here. I can apply an even more specific style to an element directly like this. And there are only a very few specific circumstances that I use this in, and you won't need this week. Know that it exists, know about it. And I think, so for me, I'd feel more comfortable talking to you about using this effectively during React week, for example, because I do that. I will sometimes use this in React if I want to maybe change a specific style programmatically. We could actually have this style value change programmatically. That's kind of powerful, and so if I have no other alternative, I might apply an approach like this. But we should look at it as files first, then style tag, then apply styles directly, because each one I think constrains us more and more, or can become a bit more specific or too specific for us. We're not reusing styles like maybe we want to across multiple pages, right? This here is only for this one element, not even all the H1 tags. And so if we need that specificity, maybe this is the solution. But most of the time, and I'd say majority of the time, we do not have to do that. We can be a bit more intelligent about how we share our styles. Okay. One last thing in the editor here, we're seeing that this color is being overwritten. That's an important thing to see. And if I disable this one, then blue comes back. And if I disable this one, we get back to red, and et cetera, et cetera. Okay. How do we feel about this? HTML, how CSS gets into HTML documents. Pretty good? Okay. So cascading style sheets, I know I've shown you some examples now. Why do we call them cascading style sheets? Anybody else? No? Go for it.
Yeah, so they work from top to bottom and they like override. So if you were to say something H1 is red at the top and then later say H1 is blue, it would say H1 is blue.
Okay, so so the first thing you said was they override, or they go from top to bottom and they override. Yeah. That is, yep, that's true. I would also say that with cascading style sheets, if I set the color of an enclosing element, the elements within that, if they do not override, will take on that same color. I have some examples of that. Are there other things that we understand the term like cascading, that actual term, like this kind of cascading, or if you can imagine or have seen a waterfall that has multiple levels, as the water goes from the top level, it hits the next level and it cascades down the waterfall. This is kind of what we're talking about here. Is that like if I apply a color attribute to my body, then throughout all the tags within that body, they will also have that color. But if I say my paragraph's a little bit different, that's kind of where it ends the line, but anything inside that paragraph could be the color that the paragraph defined. So it does, we don't have to define every single element's color to make it the same. We can use the cascading behavior of style sheets to just have that. And that's really good because that means we write a lot less code, and less code means less bugs or fewer bugs and all that, right? So here's kind of an example of that. I have this HTML tag, and everything goes in the HTML tag. Maybe I set its background color, which I don't normally think I would do. Now that I have thought about this a little bit. I think that the body of the document has a background color, whereas the HTML tag doesn't. So maybe this to me is kind of wrong. Maybe I should fix this. Okay. For illustrative purposes, it doesn't really matter. Okay. So I've just set the background color on the HTML tag here to medium aquamarine, and the color to floral white. So then the body of the document, everything inside the body now is going to have that same background color and that same actual text color as well. But the body can have its own border. It could even overwrite those values if you wanted it to. So, okay, that's about that. So here we can set the border on the body, and that's going to go around the entire body. But it's not going to give a border to every element. I think that's something that's important to call out here. Is that maybe if you said that things cascade, that if I give this tag a border property, then all of the things inside of that will have their own border properties. That's not necessarily how it works. Okay. It's not really applying that style to everything. It's just that those things are using the style inherited from the parent chain. Okay. We keep going down, and we set inside the body, we might have a div, and that div, we want to overwrite the color, the background color, overwrite and overwrite the text color. And we can do both those things. And then we go into the paragraph tag, which is a child of the div, and we set its color again, but its background remains the same. So this is what the document actually looks like. It's under cascade.html here. Should not be used as a template for new HTML documents. Important elements have been removed to allow for clarity. Okay, so that's just a little disclaimer at the top here. I just wanted to make it as kind of simple as possible. Okay. Let's load this up, because we always want to look at this stuff using our handy inspector. And we can see, if I select the HTML element here, and I can do it right inside of the elements list, the styles that are being applied, first off, the user agent style sheet. I have no reset in here. And it's saying that HTML has a display of block. We'll talk about display in a little bit. But then my styles start to come in here. And this is just my style tag that's applying this. I can tell that because it's coming from cascade.html on line 8 here, it says. I can go back to the default colors. And we can also, where is it? Is it? It's really weird. I expected there to be a computed. What if I zoom out? There it is. That's really weird. Did anyone else notice that? Okay, there it is. That's what I was looking for. Whereas this is going to show us the styles that are being applied in the order. The computed is very useful if you want to see what the final result of all that was. So these are going to be all the styles on this element after they've been applied and then overwritten, then overwritten, then overwritten. This is what it actually ends up being at the end and what it was actually applied. So keep that in mind. This computed tab is actually quite useful for that, to see what style actually made it onto this element. Okay. And for example, we're looking down here. Let's look at it even has some properties like the height and width, which might be interesting to you. Okay. Although you're not going to see me set those directly for a little while here. Okay. Let's get back to this. The body here. So we've got this document. We're now applying a border to the body element here. And so that element is going to have a 4-pixel body or border, solid, dark orange, and I can turn that on and off. And we can actually kind of see that that has an effect on the size of that element, because it kind of just pushes it has no effect on the size of that element, but it pushes all the content inward to make space for that border. Okay, so we're going to have to think about how do these things get sized. Actually, there's one thing that I forgot in my notes that I should probably show you quickly. Oh no, we're still here. Good. I'm good. It's been a little while. All right. Okay, so so we apply the body here, and then as we keep going down, we look at this div. The div is going to apply background and color. We get that here. We can see that this div, it takes up this entire space here, and it has another element inside of it, which is a paragraph tag that's taking up some of that div space as well. Okay. And as we apply styles to different things, they either inherit that behavior or that style. Here, that's what we're saying. That this paragraph that we defined here does not have its own background color, but its background color is inherited from the parent's background color, that div element, and that's the cascade effect. Okay? Any questions about cascading and how we can really reduce the amount of code by intelligently cascading styles? And then just overriding at the point where we need to. Okay. Okay. All right. So we get down here. We talked about that. Good. I want to show this to you. So this is a little bit of JavaScript that I'm going to run in the browser right now. And we don't, I mean, I can show you what it does. But we're not going to be really talking about this API until tomorrow morning. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit ahead of time. But this is really just a debugging technique I want to show you for CSS that could be quite useful. And also it explains something we're going to call the box model. So because we're in the browser now, I can execute JavaScript on my document. I go over here, go into the console, console.log, hi, or something like that, and I look, and it's printed that out for me. So I'm executing JavaScript in this environment now. I could execute this JavaScript here in this environment. What this API does is it creates an element. Do we know we know what elements are? HTML elements. That's what we're talking about. Creates an element with the style. That's a style tag. Okay, so this is the first thing I'm doing. I'm actually going to create a style tag in my document. And then I'm going to find the head of the document, and I'm going to append that style element to it. This is how it actually enters the DOM and is actually part of that document at that point. If we just create an element and don't put it into the DOM, it will not be interpreted by the browser, so we have to append it in. Okay, still, this is for tomorrow's stuff. But then I'm going to change the inner HTML of this style to have this style rule right here, which basically says absolutely everything is going to have an outline with a solid 1 pixel red outline. Does that make sense? Now, as I execute this, it's going to happen very quickly. What have I done here? I've applied a 1 pixel red outline to absolutely every element on this page. And I'm doing that to show you that everything on this page is a box. Every element here is a box. This is a little span tag down here. Span, it's a box too. So everything is a box. And when I run this code here, I've actually injected into the head of the document a style tag down here. Oops. This is what my JavaScript did for me. When I load this page up from scratch, we look at the head of the document, it's only the stuff I wrote. But if I run this code here, we're manipulating this document. We're adding new styles to it dynamically. Okay. So I'm just showing you here that everything's a box. That everything has a width and a height. All the content is going to be contained within that box that we put inside those tags. That we can create a hierarchy here with those. So sometimes you're kind of thinking, when you're trying to do maybe a more complex layout, and you're like, why is that thing not lining up properly? You could take this JavaScript, throw it on there, and see all the boxes and see how the boxes are actually behaving. Maybe I put a little bit more padding than I wanted to or whatever, right? This is actually quite useful. And you can roll over it like I'm doing here, and we can see, oops, on this right side, here's our box. As we roll over it, those are the properties of that box. The margin, the border, the padding, and all of that. As we select it here, this element, this paragraph, I think that's a paragraph. Yep, it's a paragraph. Has a top and bottom padding of 16 pixels. We can see all that. Okay. All right. How do we feel about the syntax for CSS? It's okay. We define the elements we want to apply the properties to. I guess we'll call this the rule. And then, all right. I guess here, will you just bring up some technical terms? I think it's important to learn the terms. I got these from the documentation itself. So the thing that's that names, or that we put doesn't really name, that we put before those braces, we'll call it the selector list. This is a list of comma separated element types, or selectors really. Right now we've been using very basic selectors. We've been selecting things based on the tag. We can do a whole bunch of other stuff with classes and IDs and other things like that. I will definitely be showing those examples. Once you've defined the element or elements that you want to apply that style to, you apply the property and the value of that style, and these are best place to look, MDN. You just go CSS MDN. You see a list of all the properties. There are way too many for me to list out. There's so many. Oh, look at this. I made it easy for you. There's a link in the documentation. Great. Okay. So this box model, let's talk about that. So everything's a box. That means that within the box we've got our content. So if I have a paragraph tag and then I put some text in there, the content is that text, and that's going to really define the size of that paragraph tag. Right? The more text that I have, the taller the paragraph tag is going to be. Except if the user stretches out their browser, maybe it's not as tall anymore, because we can fit more content width-wise. So as the width changes, maybe the height will adjust. The content can definitely have a dynamic size like that, and a lot of it can depend on sort of the space that we give it to render, let's say. There's other things too. Around the content, we have this idea of padding. So as I don't know, do we have any designers in here? People that have researched design and kind of white space and separation of elements, and just it is actually a big deal. With these kind of lectures, it would look a lot different here if I didn't give this any padding. If I just said, I feel it's a little tight for me. Maybe it does look good. Maybe here I don't give this any padding, right? Like, oops, come on, catch up to me. Maybe I make this exactly the width of the page, but I like to give it a bit of space around it. And we can separate things and actually draw people's eyes to things through separation. So I think it's important to use padding. So that's one of the things that we need to see we have the ability to do here. We can set the padding of it on an element, and that will actually push all the contents inwards, away from the edges. The box will still have its size. It'll still have its content, but there will be now a noticeable space between the content and the edge of that box. That's what the padding is. On top of that, we have a border. You saw I applied a border to that one of those elements in there, the body, and we can set the width of the border as well. We can say that it's a 20 pixel border or a 1 pixel border. It's also going to have an effect on the size of this element here. And you can define whether or not the border is solid, or if it's dashed or dotted, or there's lots of different line styles that we can apply. We can change the color if we want to. Then you got this idea of a margin, and the margin is it's like padding but on the outside of a box. So it pushes other elements away rather than pushing the contents inside. Yes, question? Does the border push things in or push things out? The size of the element will change based on the size of your border. So yeah. There is a way to change that behavior. Okay, cool, yeah. And we will use that because it is I find that the default behavior for this sizing is harder to work with than sort of an updated property we can change that makes it more like I set the size of this thing, and no matter what the size of my border or my padding is, everything moves inward. That size of that thing always stays the same. Whereas with this, as we change the margins, the padding, the size of our box is going to grow. Okay. So margin push things away, and we use both. There's reasons to use both. Like, I'll give you a real practical example, and you come here. I look at this. Oh, stop moving. Okay. That's going to... Well, you see this compose button here? It has the same amount of space on the top and the bottom. I would probably make its container have some padding to push that button in more, rather than giving that button maybe a margin to push the other stuff away. Does that kind of make sense? Rather than making the compose button bigger by giving it a margin, I'll just make this container push stuff in, and that's useful there. Whereas here, between this image and this text right here, I'd probably put a margin. Maybe I'd put a right margin on this image to make sure that whatever's next to it is pushed away from it. Because I guess I could give this padding or this padding, but to me, conceptually, it makes more sense just to push that element away from it rather than pushing the contents of that thing inside. Okay. So hopefully this becomes a bit more clear as we go, because it's not like a perfect science where it's just like always do padding here, always do margin here. There are it comes down to a bit of intuition at the end of the day. Okay. But that's why we're going to practice this. And I think the same thing here. This header should have maybe like a 10 pixel padding so that everything inside of it gets pushed further away from the edges. But then when I want to put the space between these two things, to me, again, it makes more sense to give this a left margin or this a right margin rather than padding this into the padding this on the left side. I wish I had a better way to do that. This totally is padding to me of the container. So this would be a footer element, let's say, with a div inside of it that shows you the time since the tweet. I would say that the footer element has padding, and that pushes the text inward. Cool. All right, so both are useful. Kind of just quick review. This is the structure, and I tried my best to match the tools that we use here, because this is your best friend in CSS. This thing is your best friend in CSS. I don't just get to turn things on and off. I can also just directly in here add styles and check them out. And when I refresh my document, those changes I made go away. This is actually how I write my CSS. Usually is, I don't quite know. I'm gonna kind of experiment in here, play around. Should I use margin or should I use padding? Let me just figure it out. And then once I have this element styles, I'll copy this, paste it into my document, reload, and now the styles will be applied for me every time. Rather than constantly going back to my text document, changing it, saving it, reloading the browser. Document, save, reload. I find that this workflow is a little bit better, so learn this tool. It's so useful for CSS. Okay? If you don't see yourself doing CSS past this week, fine, leave it. But if you see yourself doing CSS, do yourself a favor. This tool is invaluable. Okay, so we can define all these things, and I'm gonna talk about this. Then we'll take our break. All right. We can define all these things. You'll notice like things like padding and margin. We want to be able to apply them to each side of the box rather than having a consistent. Sometimes we want consistent padding around something. That's fair. But sometimes we also want to apply padding specifically to one edge of the box. And so we do have padding. We have padding, and we have padding top, and padding right, and padding bottom, and padding left. And we'll set those values here. If I want to do shorthand, I use the padding, let's say property. I use the padding property, and I say 100 pixels. And that means it's going to set the top, the right, the left, and the bottom all for me to 100 pixels. This is shorthand notation for padding. If I need to be specific, we got the top part. All right. Now, let's say that I want to apply different padding to the top and bottom than I do the left and the right side. I can do that with the shorthand, or I can do that with the long form. Kind of up to you. But the order of these properties does matter. The first property is going to be the top and bottom now, or the first value is going to be the top and bottom, and then the second value is going to be the left and right padding. It's just the way that they've decided. Okay. We can go even farther than this and say we also want to be able to find maybe the bottom. This is so rare that you would use 3 like this, but it works. Okay, so that third property is going to be the bottom now. So first is top, then the second, in the case that there is only 3, will be the left and right, or I guess in both cases left and right. And then the third property now is going to be just the bottom, okay? Don't worry, we're getting to the one that actually you might want to use more often. This is the order that it goes. First top. Exactly. Yeah. So this is what you do, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? And you should probably be doing that just to kind of remember, because the shorthand's really nice, I think, to be able to use that. But also, I'd say more important than you being able to use that or to write that is more important for you to be able to read that. That when you look at someone else's document or one you wrote before or whatever, you can immediately recognize, okay, top, right, bottom left, right? So, trouble. That'll be the acronym we use to remember this. Yes?
I was just gonna say that it's also kind of how we look at a compass, like
Yeah.
northeast, southwest,
Cool.
that's how I look at it. That might be.
Yeah, so this, for Victoria's suggestion here is it's like a compass if we go north, east, south, west. Yeah, any way we can use to remember this, it's going to be consistent. It's the same for margin. Margin will also use top, right, bottom, left in the ordering. And so this is how we use shorthand properties. And again, it's useful, but for me it's most important that you can see this and then understand what that means. Okay? Okay. I said we take a break after that, so let's take our break. And then come back, talk about block and inline elements and display property and all that. mic on and just make sure. So Victoria, I don't know who's there, but the question was, what does body parser do? Right? That's still what we're talking about? Okay, sorry. Takes a yeah, it's important to get this. So what we did first is talked about how maybe we want to when we send data to the server, if we're going to do a post request, and we have a form that looks like this, that our post request, it would be a post on /login, and this is what our HTTP request would actually look like that we'd send to the server. And so an input field has a key and a value. The value happens to be whatever we typed into the input. So let's say that I typed into the field K Jensen and the password good luck. So in my request, we send this string to the server. Okay, so now here's where we left off. What we really want, though, on the server is an object that has these values. So in between, what happens here is on every single request, we are going to use the body parser, something like that. Maybe you do like a, I don't know, extended false or something like that, right? This is what it looks like in your server. And what this is actually doing is more like this. Right? It's just middleware. Body parser is middleware. Body parser is middleware that will look at every single request. And if that request has a body, then read that body. So what we end up with is there it is. That's the body of that request. And I've just received this through the request that just came in. Okay? This is not the exact details, but this is kind of an overview. Okay, so the request gave me the plain text that was on the body. I take that here, body dot split. I can split a string, right? Split it on the ampersand. Okay? Now what I have is a array of key value pairs as strings still. So maybe what I do is take those k value pairs. Here's that key value pair. Looks like this in this case. Username equals K Jensen. And I split that further. Let's say kv.split equals sign now. Okay, so now I've got the key is equal to split 0, and the value is equal to split 1. Now key is username, value, and the value is K Jensen. So I can take that request.body object and add a key and a value to it. And then in the request that actually uses this, okay, here we'll call next. In the request that actually uses this, if I look at request.body, it was whatever I put onto it. And this is what body parser does it for you. I didn't have to write this code when I'm building an Express app because I'm using the middleware provided to me by someone else. So body parser takes plain text key value pairs, let's say, could be JSON even, if you encode it to do, or if you do or this one here, instead of URL encoded, which is this format here, now I would accept body data encoded as JSON. And it would parse it for me and then create the body variable for me, and I'd be able to grab values off that. Is that good for everyone? Yeah, okay. Yeah, takes a string, converts it into an object for us, puts it on that request. That's how we get request.body. Okay, cool. Yeah, this code is garbage. But if we looked at their implementation, which I actually recommend if you're now curious about that, go look at the body parser GitHub page, go find this implementation and see how they did that. It's a useful way to kind of get familiar with middleware. Because then you could start to write your own middleware to do things that you need to do common for your project that maybe someone has not provided a library for. Totally possible that's going to happen. Okay, cool. Any questions on that from Victoria before I move back to the CSS? Oh, yeah, sorry, I mentioned it when I put the mic back on, but basically the question was, what is body parser? And so I walked through how we can take a form, and this form creates a HTTP request that looks like this. I'm going to actually... I just want to be really clear that I would never intend on anyone writing this. It was kind of like stream of consciousness, right? So are you okay to go I post on both channels? Either way is fine. It's easy for me. I'll do that. Okay. So that's that rough example. So it was just, if I post a form using HTML like this, it creates an HTTP request that looks like this. The most important part to notice is that the body data that's being passed along looks like this, and this is not how we work within an Express server. So we need to use body parser with URL encoded, which happens to be the way that we describe this formatting here with the ampersands and the equals, let's say, into this format. It's body parser that does it. This would be a very shitty way to implement that yourself, but you totally could do it better than this. And I was saying I recommend looking at the body parser. Get bub. Can't wait for Christmas, little bub again. GitHub, and then we're just looking for body parser. Here's Express.js body parser. We kind of take a peek here. Index.js, what is it telling us about this? Oh, okay, so they got a bunch of parsers. Here's a JSON parser, a raw parser, text parser, UL encoded parser. That looks like the one we're interested in. Yeah, they've made it. Their library is much more complex because they support many different ways, many different source datas, including JSON, raw, text, and URL encoded. But if I looked into the library here, libtypes URL encoded, I should be able to see the code on how it handles the URL encoded stuff, right? So we can peek in here. URL encoded parser. What 3 parameters does it take? Rec, res, next. What does this tell us? Here's our middleware. This is it. This is what happens when we call .json or .url encoded. It returns a function that looks exactly like what I put in there, right? So that's what this is doing. When I call URL encoded, it returns a function that takes a request, response, and next. That's our middleware. And so in here, yeah, it's doing some fancy stuff. Okay, I don't have time for this. But it's a good question, because that's it's way too hard to teach that day 1 or day 2 of Tiny App. It's like so good question for now. Obviously I've taken a bit of time for that, so I got to get back to where we were. All right. Are we good in Victoria for starting? I think everyone should be there now. We're definitely good here, right? Thanks, Gabe. Okay. So let's talk about the difference between block level and inline elements. This is going to be something we can set as the display property. We can define the way that the display property of any element, and they're at the very basic level, how it all started. As I'm teaching CSS as it started, not as we use it today necessarily. So, although block level and inline are still important. Block level, this is going to be used in a situation where you want your elements to stack on top of each other vertically. A block level element is going to take the entire width of the browser, which means that the thing that comes after it is going to be below it. That's block level. So things that are popular that we use that are block level by default, H1s, yeah, only the header exists on that line. That's pretty common for us. Divs, if you create a bunch of divs, they're going to stack vertically. Paragraph tags, again, you put one after the other, they stack vertically. They are block level elements, and so they behave that way. They take up the entire width of the browser. You've also got this concept of inline elements. And inline elements, that's if we want things to be able to not take on this property, to actually stack kind of more horizontally or flow horizontally. And or maybe to not to change that the layout actually is more important, that it doesn't change the layout of the document. If I put an image in between some text, that image is going to show up right in between that text there. It's not going to make the text go to the next line. Of course, unless there was no space for it, but I kind of hope you see what I mean. Same with buttons. If I want to embed a button somewhere, it's gonna put it right in there with the text, and then the rest of the text is gonna flow right after it. Okay. So images, links should not make the next set of content drop to the next line. That would be weird. And same with input fields. Those we can embed. We can have a label, an input, another label, another input. That's how we might get a whole bunch of input fields on the same line. Well, they're inline elements, so they're going to behave that way. Do I have the example? Yes, I do, I think. Block, no, that's block float. Never mind. Block float. We'll come to that afterwards. Normally, we'll come to that too. Okay, so I'm not going to have much help here. Okay, yeah, block and inline. Okay, so I'm just going to keep talking about these here. Here's a list of the block level elements. I got this from MDN. You don't have to read this or remember this. I highlighted a few. I'm just kind of showing you that there's a big list of elements that are by default block level. Common ones that I put in here: div, 8 headers, the li. So a list item, that makes sense to me, that by default it stacks vertically. A p tag, a ul, an unordered list. Yeah, we should probably have lists stack as well. So here, this paragraph's in a block level element. That means, again, it takes the entire width of the browser. And when we get to the end of the browser, the text will drop to the next line. If I put 2 of these together, then they would stack vertically. Here's all the inline elements that I got from MDN as well. Anchor tags for links, let's say. Button elements, image elements, inputs, text area, and then a whole bunch of other stuff. And this is kind of why that's important, is let's say I wanted to change the style of some text inside of this paragraph. I would have to make sure that I either used a tag like a span that is inline by default, so that it just changes the properties, the background color of that element, rather than changing the layout around it. Or I could use a div and set its display property to be inline. That is possible. Not necessarily recommended, because a span is like a div but inline, so may as well use a span for that. Here's a situation where I have a div inside of my paragraph. So that block level element, it's going to take the entire width of the browser, and then the content that comes after it drops to the next line, as I described, right? So that kind of makes sense, the difference between these two things at a rough level. Okay. So the rule we want to keep in mind: we can nest block level elements, but we don't put block level elements inside inline elements. Okay? There's no need to do that. It's not I can't think of a reason for that to be something we would do. So yeah, just keep that in mind, I guess. There's another display property that got added sometime after, I'm not sure exactly. And when I say sometime after, I mean CSS there are different versions of CSS. So in a more recent version of CSS, we got something called inline block. We can set the size of an inline block element, whereas we can't set the size of an inline element. I can change the size of an inline block element. It will not push content down to the next line, of course, unless I make it too big. It's kind of like a hybrid between the two. It has some of the properties of one, some of the properties of the other. Okay. I don't tend to use this really these days, because we have even kind of better ways to deal with this stuff. Sorry about this. Hey. Okay, so here's a quick question. How big is this box? Well, okay, so is it 100 by 100? Okay, and why is that? Because the border. Okay, so the border changes the size of the box. Okay, so then what is the width of this box? Can you see the values easily? Or 120, 130. Okay. Sorry, the content. Well, so let's say once I've set the width and the height, the content will be no longer relevant. Sorry, I didn't mention that. Yeah. So with a div element, with any block level element, we can set the width and the height on it. And that will then be the content size. So it doesn't matter what we put in there after that, the content size, it'll just either fit or not fit and be cut off, right? So let's say that the width and the height of this content area, or our intention is the width and the height is 100. We've talked about padding and border and how that might impact it. So we're saying 130? No. Well, it's closer. 160, yeah. So we want 160 by 160 because as we add the 20, yeah, both sides, exactly. We're going to add padding to both sides, so that's going to add an extra 40 pixels to the width. And then we add another 10 pixels to each side. It's going to add another 20. So we're going to end with 160 by 160. Yes? With the box sizing that we use by default, so the behavior, or the default behavior, it does push the content in, but it changes the it actually adds to the size of the box. When we talk about the box, we mean the overall box that's kind of invisible, not the box, not necessarily the box that we see the content in. Is that kind of? Yeah. Right. So yeah, so for Victoria, the question is, doesn't the padding push content in? So how could it possibly increase the size of the box then? It's sort of the way that it works is that the padding will get pushed in, but actually the box will grow in size. It'll look like the padding will look like it's being pushed in. It will have the space between the edge, but the edge grows out by default. Okay. But if I change the box sizing property, now it goes back to what we want it to and how we're talking about it, right? This is actually really important because I prefer to write my CSS this way because then it does work in the way that I want it to, which is if I set the width and height in something, this is 100 by 100, and everything grows from that 100 in, and we do, yeah, cut off the size of the content, let's say, even more, but I have a predictable size now, right? So this box sizing, border box, is a property that we will want to apply if we wanted to take on this behavior, that we opt into this behavior. The default for this box sizing property is called content box. Content box. So that's what they'd apply. That's what you'd see by default, content box. My next example, I have this style in it. I mean, not right at the top, but pretty close. This means every single element is now going to have border box sizing, which means now if I set the width and height of something, it will be that width and height, and no matter what my padding, my border, my the margin, I'm not. Remember, I said I'm not 100% confident. Do you know the margin? Ooh, I'd have to test it. Yeah, cool. I mean, it's the kind of thing to test out. We could play with that. I did spend some time talking about body parser, so maybe we could leave that to the end and play with it. I think that, yeah, I'll come back to that. I just want to make sure I get through some of this other stuff. Okay, so my next example, let's see, is this right? Yeah. So normalize.css, I said I'd talk more about resets. You saw my basic reset that I included. Came from, I think it was Eric Meyer. Normalize CSS is a library, a CSS library we could use. And it says that normalized CSS makes browsers render all elements more consistently and in line with modern standards. It precisely targets only the styles that need normalizing. I don't know what styles those are. So using a library like this, they've put a lot of thought, effort into that. Reset is good. Normalize, I think, could be even better, right? Maybe more thorough. Maybe they're keeping it up to date more. I mean, I just copied this off the other one off someone's blog post. if things change, I don't expect that to necessarily change. Whereas a library like this that has a proper distribution method, let's say, either through this download button or you can install it through NPM, I kind of recommend this for this week. And it's saying that it has support for these browsers. They put effort into making it have support for those browsers. So I'd say that the reset that we'd want to use these days is probably normalized.css. Okay? And it's just, when I click download, it really just is a bunch of CSS. Oops, that's better. Setting the margin to 0, making sure that main has a display of block. That's kind of cool. Okay, so setting the H1. I don't know. Bunch of resets or normalization. Reset is, I guess normalization and reset is a slightly different concept, but the normalization is really just about making all the browsers behave the same. That's our constant battle. All right. Okay, so this is where we get into, let's say, heavy waters or something like that. The internet and CSS and HTML, that was created a long time ago now. And that means that we have quite a history to work with. Documents used to be very straightforward. They looked a lot like what you'd see in your word processor. Headers and titles and paragraphs and maybe some images and stuff like that. Maybe you want to do something like with an image that looks like this. Kind of like a newspaper, right? Where you have, yeah, question. Oh, thank you. Can you separate the default styling from your main CSS document, whatever you choose to call it? Yes, okay, thanks, Gabe. So to be clear, what I would do is I download that normalized.css file, and then I put it in the directory, let's say with my HTML here. So now I can access that and import that file right here, okay? I could link to a style.css as well. I decided to keep these styles for this example specifically inside the HTML so I didn't have to switch back and forth. But my recommendation is that normalized.css is downloaded and left unmodified and then imported early on in your document. Anything that's custom afterwards would... You could say, well, here's the styles for a button. Here's the styles for a forms. You could break it up like this too if you wanted to. You don't have to. You could say, well, it's a pretty straightforward site, so I'll just put everything in styles.css or main.css or like you just name this thing, right? But the separation, like I said, I can't give you the rules for that. It's just kind of what makes sense for you. You have to play around with it, and I'd say observe sort of what other sites do. Anytime you go to a website, you can kind of, yeah, you can usually see how they've sorted that out. I hope that answers the question. Yeah, you would do it in normal. At the end of the day, normalize is no different than just a normal style sheet that you didn't write, basically. But you could have written this if you wanted to, and it would be treated exactly the same way as if you wrote it locally. Cool. All right. Thanks for the heads up on the question. That always helps me out. So get back to this. Back when the web was created, they had a lot different requirements than they do today. They were building scientific documents they were sharing. So you might want to have an image, Fig 2-1 or something, for your scientific research that gets embedded in the document next to the text that's talking about it. That could be very useful. Or, I mean, newspapers, that's very common in there where you have an image and then text that flows around that image. So there's this thing called Float that was designed to support that type of behavior, this newspaper style behavior. And then clever developers, without any other options, said, well, we can use this to solve a problem that we have nowadays, which is the multi-column layout problem. Normally documents flow top to bottom, and we don't really care about the width. As we just stretch it, the paragraphs, maybe they get a bit tighter or what. But that's not the web we use today. Now we use a web where we have more of a design like this. Big header, maybe trying to sell you something, big call to action button. And then below it, maybe some features of this app or whatever that you're building. And so these come in columns, and we want those columns to maybe take up the same amount of height or something like that, right? It's difficult to do with inline elements, because inline elements don't have a width and height, we can't apply those properties to it. And div elements would stack these things vertically instead. So the hack is this float property. Good, yeah. Oh, can it be put in header.ejs to use on all pages? That's also a good question. So if we're thinking about Tiny App, which I might have, oh, let's see. Oh, there's one. Now the question is, did I put headers on this? Views, partials, header. Oh, brilliant. All right. Login does not care about it. Register does not care about it. Okay, so not brilliant enough to have more than one page, but just imagine that I also had URL show, URLs, etc., right? So here I'm including this partial called header. Yeah, I would say if you created a head partial that contained only the common styles and maybe, sorry, anything else that you want to include in the header document, which I think is what you did, if I put a link tag inside of that head EJS file, it will include it into it will use that in every single template that uses that partial. So yes, you can put it maybe not header.ejs, because header might not go into the head of the document. I might do something like this. That's different. Head and header are different here. And so my head partial, oops. I don't need that, do I? Yeah. And I need to put the type and style sheet, whatever stuff on there, but if I did this, my expectation is that every file, oh, I did. Wow. What a guy. Okay. This is when I started teaching here, I was asked, told to do the projects to make sure that I could help with them. So I've just included this partial into each of these. It's basically like taking this stuff and copying and pasting it in there, right? Except I only have to change it in one place later on. So this would behave in each of those files just like that, and then I get the behavior that I think is being described there. So make sure so the reason why I'm spending so much time on this is because you said header.ejs specifically. I would not want my style, my link tag to go in my body, and it would if I put it in the header partial here. That makes sense? So that's why I created this head partial to go in the actual head of the document, so that those styles would go in the head of the document, which is important to me. Cool? Okay. It's a good question. Thanks. All right. So, where I was going to go next was the lecture week 3. Okay. So, block float. There we go. This is what we're going to end up with at the end. Doesn't look too fancy, but the idea is we want to talk about how we could actually create elements that we can change the size of and also have them flow horizontally. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but for a long time it was a big deal. Now we got things like Flexbox to help us with this problem, right? Today I use Flexbox to solve this problem. I don't want that to be lost on you. But if we just go to Flexbox right now, you don't feel any of that pain from before. You don't understand. You look at some code that uses this old float style, and you're like, what the fuck are they doing? I don't blame you. It's kind of like it's a hack. It is a workaround. It's a hack. And I think it's even just for learning how people use CSS in interesting ways to work around problems. This is a great example of that. So let's start off by just getting rid of all of the HTML that's in here. Actually, I'll leave one box. It's going to be a regular box. No floating. No, not yet. All right. And I guess I'll keep. So I've got a bunch of properties here. I'm going to make sure I use that border box sizing, which is important to me. I want to make sure that if I set the box at 200 by 200, that it is never bigger than 200 by 200. The body here, I'm going to set a font, the background color, and a basic font size just across the board. All my boxes are going to use this font size as well. I want that big text in there, so I'm using 2 rem. Do we want to know what rem means now? Yeah, you're curious, right? Okay, so there's lots of different units in CSS. Pixel, point, rem. Rem is one that I'm using here. This is actually a font size relative to the root text size. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Okay, my root text size at the top level of my document is 12 pixels. If I say now that in the body my font size is 2 rem, it's going to take this and multiply it by 2 for me and then use that value. Now I change at the root my root size to be 16 pixels. How big is this font now? 32. So it's relative to that root element's pixel size, or the amount of pixels for that. And by default, I believe the font size is 16 pixels. So if I use 1 rem, my fonts will be 16 pixels. If I use 2 rem, my fonts will be 32 pixels, etc. Yes? Yeah, so the question is, if I don't specify it in here, which you don't need to, it will use the default, which is 16 as far as I know. And I'm not sure, maybe the normalize.css will change that and set that for you. This unit is useful to me because I will do things like set the padding relative to the size of my font, maybe, right? I might say that I want my padding to be 32 pixels, but 2 rem makes more sense because then if the font size changes, then my padding size might also change with that. Might be a bit more kind of responsive in that way. I also like the fact of relative things like this because, I mean, this is relatively new, and I think it's mostly for that purpose. I don't expect you to use this. I just kind of wanted to show you that it was there. If you use pixels for this entire project, probably not going to... I think the assignment has rem in it as well, and that's another reason I put it on here. So I would use it where it instructs you to use that, and just keep it in mind if you load up a document and you go in here. Remember I said we can look at the HTML computed. Oh, where is it? Property. No. Yeah, I don't think it actually it's not telling us here what the font size is. Oh wait. Huh. That's cool. Ah, there we go. They were just hiding it from me. Right, so 16 pixels is the font size here for that HTML. And I had to click this Show All button up here in order to see that. Okay. So I clicked Show All. I was able to see all the default properties for this one tag that I've clicked on right now. If I want to check the default properties for the body, I can do that as well. So yeah, by default it's 16. 2 rem means 32 pixels, and that's just going to be, yeah, that's good. Ah, so the difference, what's the question is, what's the difference between rem and m? Rem is like root, I believe. I don't know if that's actually what it stands for. That's how I'm thinking about it, because it only cares about that base level HTML, whereas m cares about the size of the font in the parent, the container above it, kind of, right? So yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks for checking. Yeah. M is relative to the font size of the direct or nearest parent. So if the parent doesn't have that defined, then the next parent and they have that defined, M would use that. Whereas rem is going to go all the way up to the root, and it does. Oh, good. As in root em. I knew I'd read that. I kind of just yeah. Okay. Every div is going to have a 6-pixel solid border. You noticing I'm using shorthand for this. I could have border Size? No. Width? Yeah. 6 pixels. Border out. Style, yeah. That's a good one. Solid. I could do things like dashed, dotted kind of stuff in that as well. And then border, I believe, I'm sure color is the one for this. So you'll notice I was able to define those 3 styles on the border property, or I could break it down like so. Okay. I define the color of the div. That's just so that the text is white inside. Okay. And then every single div element, every box is going to be 200 by 200. There's going to be 20 pixels of padding, and the margin is going to be 10 pixels. So this is actually going to be a good way for us to test out what we had talked about before. If I click on this, if I look at the width of this thing, it's 200 by 200, and that is a combination, or so 148 plus 20, 26, 36, 72. Looks like 62. Wow, I'm really bad at this. Does it include this is the question. The 200 pixels. 140. 12. 32, 42. It does not. Okay. So it's just the border, the padding, and the content then, right? Yeah. The margin's outside of the size of that box. Yeah. So we answered that question that we had, which I think that's pretty intuitive. I think it's intuitive that way. Yeah, to me it's intuitive. Yeah, pushing everything, exactly. Yes, your personal, yes, the margin is my personal space, exactly. Cool. So that confirms that. Okay, let's get rid of all this HTML, and I'll get rid of this style here, and we'll reload this. Okay, so this is the box we're starting with. If I wanted to add another box, this is what I get. These boxes have a display property of block. So this box here is taking up the entire width of the browser. Its margin is going to take up whatever space it does not. We can see the margin is actually is doing that right here, automatically taking up all the space till the rest till the end of the browser window. For both of these, I want these to stack. I want these to be horizontal. So what if I did this instead? Now this is what happens when we change it to inline. Yeah, one of the things we want, which is for them to be horizontally laid out, that works. But what broke? The size, because we can't change the height and width of an element that's inline like this. Problem solved? Kinda, right? Okay. But there was a time before inline block existed, and that's where floats come in. Okay, so we're gonna have to go back into a time where we didn't have all these great options. Go back to and change our display to block here. We'll keep actually that's default, so we don't need to set that. We'll just keep this. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna create a property called float. This is me creating a tag with the class float. That's what the dot means. Tag name dot and then the class name. And I don't need that there. Now anything that uses the class float would have this property. Now only divs that use the class float have this property, right? Okay, cool. We'll talk about specificity this afternoon though, and kind of how we name these things so that the right styles get applied. I like to put that there just kind of for this example specifically. We're going to say that the float is left. Oops, is that right? And then now what I need to do is take this class and apply it here. All right, that's better. Okay, so does this look good? Yes.
Yes, but if you're applying float to both of them, how does it know not to jam on top of each other, or why aren't they
That's a really good question. So the question is, if I'm applying float to both of them, then why are they not both going all the way to the left? I mean, when it comes to it, they are being there's this concept of being kind of lifted out of the flow of the document. So as we have all these div elements, they're being placed in the flow of the document. So you got the div, and then it flows down to the next line. You got the div, it flows to the next line. Or with an inline element, you're putting these things next to each other, and they are flowing in that way, right? When you float something, it no longer is taking up that space in the original document. But the elements that are floated next to each other, they do have to respect each other's space. Okay. So we're going to add a few more of these. Oh, I think as we go forward, it might become, I don't know, maybe become more clear. The other thing is here, I want to make sure maybe if I have some guesses about how that works. Okay, good. They're in the right order. That's a good thing. And if I wanted these things to be on the right, I could float them over there as instead, but you'll notice the order for those, okay? It's good, right? Yeah, it's sweet. So let me just show you the problem, because this all looks good right now. We just add float to it and it works, right? Remember, we don't have inline block at this point, so that's why we didn't just do that. I want to now create a second set of boxes. So I got my first set of boxes, and I want to create my second set of boxes, let's say, right? Or maybe, yeah, I'll just start creating some more boxes. Maybe one box, this one doesn't float. And so this is what happens, is we try and put something after this. Sorry? Yeah, it's behind it because, like I said, some of the stuff was taken out of the flow of the document. So as far as the document flow is concerned, the fourth box goes where the space is for it, which is right at the beginning of the document again. And if I were to put a few of these, well, they're stacking on top. They're stacking vertically because it's they're block level elements, right? So the question is, how do we get these things below? Yeah, I mean that's so one way we could do this is I could there's this concept, so floats need to be cleared so that the stuff after them doesn't care about them anymore, really. So I'm going to put that in here. I'm going to make this thing a div that knows to clear how to clear the actual float, or clear both, or clear. You can say clear left, you can say clear right, and you can say clear both. Okay, so now, since this element here clears the float for me, the stuff below it will get rendered where I would expect it to, right? And this is kind of frustrating because that means I have to put one of these things, even if I get rid of this text here and get rid of the border and stuff like that and kind of hide this thing, I'm still adding extra elements, which is kind of frustrating to me. I don't want to put things like that. So there are solutions to this. They call it the clear fix. And is this no? We want. You know what? Probably best if I just go to my notes here. And all about floats from CSS tricks. This is a good one. Oh, this is what happened. They changed their design. It looks way better too. Well, kind of. Maybe this is why they changed it. So they could have a big ad right here. Okay. So this is talking about float left and float right. And sort of where we got to so far. How do we clear that float? They said you can use this, set this property, right? Where's the good one though? CSS tricks clear fix. Yeah, this is the one. So because people didn't want to add these elements in to represent that clear fix, we're going to use something this pseudo element, and they're saying here anything IE8 and up will support this. So we could use this today without any of that concern. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this CSS, and instead of applying that to the div itself, maybe what I'll do is I'll give this a row tag, and my row after will apply these properties, which should clear it. So, and then we need to, float these, and then we need another box down here that's going to show us whether or not that actually behaves the way we want it to or not. Let's say, I don't care about the numbers anymore, I'm not going to fix that. Well, so these are not wrapped in a row. So the question is, do I need to get rid of this clear? These are not wrapped in a row, so this will not be applied to my first set of boxes. So this set of boxes is going to be solved by putting a clear afterwards. But this set of boxes are in a row here, and the row has the clear fix being applied after it, to the after pseudo element here, which is basically in the space kind of like here. We'll see in the debugger. And then we have our boxes again. So, I don't need to clear it. I guess I could get rid of it, but then that likely breaks the first set. I'd have to put that in a row to fix it again. Yeah. All right. Here we go. So I want my row. Maybe. So I've got my row now, and I think that even though I'm adding an extra element, the concept makes way more sense to me too, because when I'm creating a grid like this, which I really am, right? At the end of the day, we use grids to define these layouts. The concept of rows and columns, which is what these are, rows and then the columns inside of those rows, I think conceptually this makes sense. To me, this is actually a pretty good solution to this problem. And this is what you're going to see if you use Bootstrap 3, because Bootstrap 4 uses Flexbox now, so they've evolved. But older versions of Bootstrap would use this technique to create their grid system. And what you would do in your HTML is do things like div class row, and then in my row, it's column of size 1, let's say, and I could put then a column of size 3. And you might see stuff like this in grid systems across the board, okay? Great, thanks. You just put the different sets of boxes into different divs. So that question, not quite. If I just put this in a div, so I'm going to get rid of my clear fix. That doesn't work for me. I can't just put it in a div. Right. It's this that we need to have happen before we can go back into our regular layout. And so by wrapping it in a div with a row property, or with a row class that actually has this being applied to, I'll kind of show you where it shows up in here. Here's after. And so after these floated elements, here. I don't understand. So in order to solve the problem of needing to clear the float, or right. Okay. So div class equals float box 2. Like, are we actually I'm still not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure what the alternative is what we're actually suggesting here. So would it be div class float, and then each of these would have their own? I don't know. Well, I don't wanna leave it. You know what? It should be let's talk about it after I finished off this stuff, and then I can even do a video chat with you, and then we can message the group back. That might work too. Yeah. Okay. So that way I'll get through the rest of this. Okay, so where I left it off, let's go back to all right. So I'm able to do the stacking. You saw with inline block. Sorry, I could do that as well. I have to clear this float. We can see if I look at my document under this set of row here, the row has a pseudo selector of after here, and these selectors are actually outside the scope of today's lecture, unfortunately. But when I put this into the document like this, row after, it's really talking about the stuff after the thing, the stuff that's inside the row. So it's giving us an opportunity to apply some styles without creating a specific div for that at the end here. That is going to take on styles just like any other element will. And the most important thing here is that we're clearing the float for these boxes. Okay. Make sense? All right. One more thing that I think I had here. Oops. That's the clear fix. And so I'm going to disable this, and we're going to see that our stuff will break again. So it's not working right now. I got one more option. This is again because CSS is constantly changing. Dot row overflow, and I believe it is yeah, it's hidden. Yeah, so we can set that as well, and that kind of does that clear fix style thing as well. The tough part about teaching this is that I don't recommend any of these solutions. Like I just for me, exactly. I'm showing you this where we came from because we do have to understand this, and I find that once people see float, they kind of use that for everything. I want to move something over to the right, I'll right float it. But if we don't understand that, if we don't clear that, things coming after it are going to behave differently because of this. How there's like two flows for the content. We have to understand that no matter what, and then we're going to use Flexbox hopefully, right? I think for this project you're going to use float just to kind of get it locked in, but I think the next chance after that you get to use Flexbox, it's a good opportunity. Final projects for sure, maybe midterms, I'm not sure. Yeah, Flexbox and Grid. I will talk about Flexbox and Grid more this afternoon. All right, so that was float, and clear. This afternoon, if you are curious, you can head over to CSS hard notes. So this afternoon, go to hard mode. There's a section down here where we ultimately want to get to, and why I even have to talk about this is when we talk about building layouts, which is why we're all here. We're not here to build like blog posts. We're here to build layouts for applications, right? And so when it comes to layouts, grids are so important. And so we're going to see that this pattern here that we use this afternoon to lay out a page, maybe even if we go over to my notes, here's a tweeter kind of container. And if we look at this, oops, sorry, open it up. The way that it's defining its content is through this grid. It's saying that I have this row here, or two rows, one row, and two rows. What are my two rows? One is the header. It's the top row. Two is this row down here that has all the content. I just have two rows. Okay. How many columns does this row up here have? Could be one. I did it in two, and the reason I did it in two is because I want to be able to have this side of it position elements to the right, and I want this side of it to position elements to the left. So what I did is I split it up into two, and instead of using float right, I set the alignment of this thing to the right instead. But if I just had this as one column, all of this stuff would have all gone to the right. And so this was a way for me to separate this into two containers and have those alignment properties be different. How many columns in the bottom row? 3, yeah. 1, 2, and 3. And this is overall 12 columns. So the left column is going to take up 2 of those, the size of 2 columns, and the right side is going to take up the size of 2 columns. So that's always going to be consistent. Or actually, sorry, that's going to change with the size of the browser. It's a percentage thing. I'm going to get into that this afternoon. I don't want to go too far more without explaining it. Okay. But there is a reason that we go through this, right? And this uses floats. And it's actually different than how you're asked to do it in the assignment. So tons of learning to be had. Flexbox grid, good. That's it for me. The notes are here. And, like I said, Flexbox got almost 100, we're getting really high support for that now. So most browsers will support this. If I click on this, we can see where I get that information from. I go to caniuse.com and I search for Flexbox, and I said these are the browsers that support it. A little bit of support in IE 11. Partial support is due to large amount of bugs present. Sounds fun, right? But iOS Safari, all the way back to version 7. Android, quite a bit back as well. So Flexbox to me now is the solution for creating layouts that have rows, columns. There's way too much for me to teach you today, so I've given you some resources to things that I found to be useful. CSS Tricks is a site that's been around for a long time. It definitely helped me when I was learning. We got this box model thing too if you want to play around with that sizing stuff. They've got this interactive model, and you can kind of play around with it and see how changing different properties changes the size of the thing. As I change the margin, the width isn't changing. I don't know. Are these using border box? It's using content box. You can switch between and see what happens when you swap these two things. Kind of useful. Okay. Learn layout. So a lot of the stuff that I talked about today, I went really fast. This would be, again, step by step. Display property, using margins and all that kind of stuff. So the box model, kind of a useful step-by-step tutorial if you're still kind of unclear on how we can use these properties to create layout. It's a great set of blog posts here, a list apart. These are not just the people that write a lot of CSS, they're also the people that define what CSS is today and going to be tomorrow. So that's quite useful to see their point of view on these things. Here's a link to grid layout and get BEM. So BEM, once you learn a lot about CSS and you start to build these massive websites that use tons and tons of CSS, we have to start to build our CSS in a way that's maintainable and easy to reuse and all of that. So BEM is this concept where we can, it's a methodology they call it, where we can apply rules to how we define our, how we name different elements, blocks, modifiers is what they're saying here. This is all about CSS, large-scale CSS architecture. You don't learn this today, But eventually, if you're going to be doing CSS professionally in your career, it's good to learn these things. If you're just going to be doing back-end development, I wouldn't learn this most likely. Yeah, question. Okay, a question is, does Bootstrap use the same methodology? If we look at Bootstrap's styles, Bootstrap CSS, great. I don't think they use BEM specifically, but I learned a lot by looking at the way that they structured their framework. So if I go to, I want to find buttons, because it's a really good example of how you can use multiple classes to compose the styles for a button, right? Let's see, button. Okay, here. I was able to, yeah, under components, we go to buttons. Okay. So there's a button, obviously there's a button tag, but then you can also apply styles. And so Bootstrap's decided to use BTN as their kind of base style for buttons. So we'll see all these buttons that we create here are going to all have the class BTN. And it's kind of looking BEM-ish to me because they're doing this kind of sort of like a modifier to it. That this button, the difference is this is a button that describes primary action, whereas this button down here, danger, describes something you want to be careful of, right? So I could say that this is button blue and this is button red, but if the colors that we want to use differ or change for danger, then and we make it something else, then the naming might have to change as well to be represented. So I'd think that the naming like this is actually very useful. We've described, instead of the color, we're describing the kind of the concept of the button. And then the styles themselves, where we define those properties, they define what it means to be a danger button. So we apply that here. So we've combined these two things together. Now, I could change the size of this as well, right? And so if I want a button that is that has the, I guess, colors of a primary button, and it is large, then I'm going to compose all these classes together to create that, rather than creating a style called button primary large. I want to create a style called a base one for all buttons. Maybe that gives me rounded corners and no outline. All buttons, okay, I don't want that across the board, so that's BTN. And then BTN primary is just background color blue. BTN danger is background color red, and now I'm applying those styles as well. BTN large, that's only going to describe the size of the button, right? So think about it in those terms, and that's where ultimately why we want to get to BEM, is because then we can create a whole bunch of these styles, and I can put, I can make a button primary and a large primary button and a large danger button, or a small primary button and a large danger button, or any combination of these things without changing any of my styles. And this is the power of kind of like architected CSS, I think. I hope that answers your question. Okay, cool, yeah. Here, one of the other properties they want to add is button block, and what that's doing is making it a block level element, so it takes the entire width of the container that it's in. Kind of useful. If you have a login panel and you don't want it just to be a little button that says login, you want it to take up the whole width but still say login, make it a block element and it'll take up the whole width of the container. Yeah. So composing styles is one of the strengths of CSS. It's ultimately where we want to get to, and we don't get there if we use IDs for everything. Okay? That's where I'm going to leave it. Don't use IDs for everything just because it feels easy. Gets us into trouble. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.